Hi class, and welcome to Chapter 7. Chapter 7 is all about measuring the nation's income. You all probably watched the news and heard the gross domestic product, otherwise known as the GDP. Actually, in the quarter 2020, using the Federal Reserve's data, gross domestic product in the United States was 21,537,970. But what does that mean? Obviously, as you can look at this graph, we can see that it is going upward. But why do we care? And that's what we're going to learn today. So, Chapter 10, measuring the national income, gave you a preview of that, and it has to do with, obviously, the gross domestic product. So remember back to the circular flow diagram when we were talking about looking at ways of looking towards an economy and seeing how different factors affected it in a simple or visual perspective. And the circular flow diagram allows us to see GDP as spending, revenue, factors of payment, and income. So back to the circular flow diagram. Preliminarily, we had two things. What did we have? We had the factors of production, which are inputs like labor. There are things like what else? There are things like land, capital, natural resources. Labor, who's labor? Labor is us. And then there's factors of payments. What are payments? Well, we get paid in wages. We get paid in rent. Those are things that get paid. Payments, they get paid for our production. Remember the circular flow diagram, households own the factors of production. And we rent or we sell them to firms for income. I know it sounds a little bit strange, but when you are working for a company, you are renting them your time, aren't you? Or selling them their time, depending on how you view it. Yes, we're not selling human beings, but we are selling time. And we as households also buy and consume goods and services. Firms, on the other hand, buy or hire the factors of production. So for instance, they may buy land or they may rent land. They may hire laborers and they use them to produce goods and services. Now, if it's raw materials that are going into this, like factors of production, such as a raw material like a tree, they're going to be buying it, correct? But land, they could be doing a rent or they could be doing a buy. And what else do firms do? They sell the goods and services. So the circular flow diagram allows us to look at those two groups in terms of how they represent the economy and where the economy flows. So here we are. We have the top of the circular flow diagram. We have our firms and we have our households. So when it comes to goods and services, what's happening here? Firms make goods and services. They sell them in the market for goods and services. Who is purchasing those goods and services or getting those goods and services? Households. Households are the ones who take those goods and services. Follow the red line across. Now, households, to get those goods and services, have to pay money. That money goes into that market and goes back out the other side and then becomes revenue to the firm. So, to say that in words, the market for goods and services is a place where households spend their money buying goods and services. Notice I said spend their money. So they buy goods and services, the red line, and the green line represents the money going into the market. This is a place where firms sell their red line, goods and services they produce and receive revenue, the green line, the money. The flow, as I said, the green is always the money, nicely, and the red, or it could be another color, is the flow of goods and services. On the other side, remember, we had two markets. We had the market for factors of production. Those are what? Labor, land, resources. Households bring factors of productions into there. They may bring their labor, they may rent land, they may sell land, they may sell oil, they may sell raw materials such as timber. Those in turn go out and become part of the firm's actual factors of production. The laborers who work in a factory, the lettuce that goes into your lettuce wrap. In turn, firms spend money. And that money goes to the households who own ultimately the factors of production. Oh, I forgot to clear. So the factors of production is a place where households offer their labor, their capital, and other factors such as land. And what do they receive? They receive money, the green line. The firms use these factors of production. In this case, the money flows from the firms to the households. And what happens? In the form of wages, in interest for the capital. Because we will get to the banking system, and of course, capital is required for the purchases of what? Things such as capital goods. Capital goods are what? Factories, plants, trees, etc. And then rent. The factors of production flow from the households to the firms so they can produce more goods and services. So when you put these together, you've got the circular flow diagram. And the exchanges made in the economy apply a redistribution of rent according to the diagram. And what it's doing is it's making the economy grow. Now, the circular flow diagram is really handy. Why? Because it allows us to look at where money's coming from and where money's going and where factors of productions and goods and services are going. So, if we are in an economic recession, what happens? Firms may choose to do what? Buy less product, buy less factors of production. So they may use less labor, they may use less resources. When this money becomes less and this particular flow goes inward, then the flow into the households becomes smaller. Well, if that becomes smaller, then what happens to the money going to the goods and services market? Well, households have less money, so this becomes smaller. If this becomes smaller, then this becomes smaller. And then what happens? This becomes smaller, and then this becomes smaller, and then this becomes smaller. And what are we doing? Is the economy contracting? Yes. How does this relate to the GDP? Well, I just kind of put it up here for you. So remember we talked about the households, and the households are giving land and labor and capital into the factors of production market, that they are becoming factors of production. The firms are creating goods and services. The goods and services are being bought by the households. I just showed you the red line. Now, at the same point in time, firms are paying rent and profit and wages. Those are actually part of the GDP. That becomes income. The income becomes what? Money spent. Money spent becomes revenue. So the green line is literally looking at the gross domestic product of the United States, because without those factors, there would be no product. Now, what did that diagram emit? Well, the diagram emitted the government. As we all know, the government does what? They take taxes. Taxes are not in there. Taxes are going to take money out of the circular flow, right? We're flowing like this. What's the government going to do? Money's going to have to go somewhere. It's going to go out of the circular flow diagram, isn't it? Financial systems. Financial systems are matching the saver's supply of funds with the borrower's demand. So this is allowing money to go into the factors of production. It's also allowing money available to buy things for firms, but it's also allowing consumers to buy things like houses and other things, right? And then, of course, there is the foreign sector. They are in here too. They are bringing in goods and services right in here, aren't they? And they are also involved in providing money into the financial aspects of this as well. So although the circular flow diagram does show us the United States, it does omit certain factors, and it's important to remember those. So what is this gross domestic product? Well, the gross domestic product is made up of a few parts. And we're going to basically look at the definition and look at each of the pieces. So the gross domestic product is the market value of all the goods, final goods and services produced within a country in a given period of time. All right, let's pull this out. Market value. Goods are valued at their market price. So all goods are measured in the same units. So in this case, in the United States, in order to know the market value, we use the US dollar. Things that don't have market value are excluded. So the homework you do for yourself does not have any market value, so it is not included in the gross domestic product. Final goods. So the market value of all final. What does the final mean? Final goods are intended for the end user. Intermediate goods are components or ingredients in the production of other goods. So for instance, when you buy a car, if you're lucky, your car has tires. So here is your little beautiful car. And here are the tires. When you buy your car, those tires are considered an intermediate good. They're a component that goes into the final purchase of the car. So the car itself, in total, when it walks off the dealership's floor, is a final good. The tires are an intermediate good. Now, let's say you get a flat. Well, it looks kind of like there's a flat already there. And you have to replace a tire. When you replace the tire, that is considered to be a final good because it is intended for its end user. When you bought the car, the tires were intended for the Ford, GM, Toyota, and they in turn were going to give it to the end user, you. So the GDP only includes final goods. The intermediate goods in theory are actually embodied in the value of the good that's sold as a final good. In other words, Toyota knows how much they pay for each of the components that goes into the car, including those tires. So they've included that in the price of the overall vehicle, hopefully. If they haven't, they won't be in business very long, will they? What do we mean about goods and services? Goods and services are things tangible, goods, DVDs, mountain bikes, beer, hamburgers, etc. And intangible goods are also considered to be goods and services. And they're intangible usually because they're services. So dry cleaning, concerts, cell phone service, you can't look at those and say they exist, but you know they exist because otherwise your phone wouldn't work. Otherwise you couldn't hear any music at a concert. Otherwise your clothes wouldn't be clean. The market value of all final goods and services produced. So the GDP includes currently produced items, goods and services, not goods produced in the past. So it's an important one. We'll find out what happens to a good that's produced in the past. What happens to that car that was produced last year? Yes, we'll find out in a second. Within a country. This is defined as literally within a country, within our borders. And it doesn't matter, wow, this is a tricky one, whether it's done by its own citizens or by a foreigner located here. So think about that. When a Honda is produced in Indiana, it is counted as part of the GDP. Yes, we all know Honda is a Japanese company, but what happened? It was produced here in a given period of time. Now, the GDP, as we saw in that particular diagram I showed you, was a yearly one. And there's a quarterly one. We saw Q1 of 2020. There will also be a 2019 final GDP as well. So why do we look at quarterly and yearly? Because quarterly will give us an indication of how the economy is going from the previous short period of time. Yearly allows us to compare year over year over year over year for as long as we've measured the GDP. So, what is the GDP for you and me? It measures the total income of everybody in the economy. Why? Because it's measuring the total expenditures of the economy's output of goods and services. So, economically speaking, the income of the entire economy has to equal how much we spent. Why? Because of that circular flow diagram. Notice there was nothing in there that had one of these not the same as one of these, right? Everything came in, everything went out, everything came in, everything went out. Thus, income of an economy has to equal the expenditures of that economy. Because every dollar a buyer spends is a dollar of income for the seller. Yes, I understand that that's a little different than income as you and I think about it, but it is the way we look at the way a society looks, the total income of everybody in an economy. And it allows us to compare across different places in the world. So it is rather handy on many levels. So you can see how by knowing every dollar that's being spent in an economy and knowing where every dollar is being every dollar of income, you can start to see how an economy looks, what its amount of income that is available is. So how do we look at that as an equation? Because you're probably thinking to yourself, that was all very nice and good, but what in the world, how do I actually measure this? How is the Federal Reserve actually getting to that number? Well, the Federal Reserve is getting to that number by looking at the following. They're looking at consumption. What is consumption? Consumption is usually by households, and it's goods and it's services. Back to what we were talking about before. It's goods such as groceries and clothes and iPods and phones and computers and whatever else. And it's services such as haircuts and oil changes and education. It's also investment. What's investment? Now, investment here is a little different than what we think about an investment. When we as a nation think about investment, we think about things like stocks and bonds. And we'll get into those a little later. But here, an investment is fixed assets for production. So they're actually things used to produce goods and services. So for instance, a factory is considered an investment. A business, for instance, a storefront would be considered a business. Now, what about the homes? What is an investment for a home? A home a home is an investment for a household. Sorry, a household is a home is an investment for a household. So that is considered an investment. The other thing that's an investment for a business is inventory. So when you drive by a car dealership and you see cars on a lot that are brand new, those are investments. They're investments because they have been things that have been made and where the company is investing in the fact that they will sell them. Now, there are also included in here is government expenditures. Why is the government included in the GDP? Well, you may be wondering, but if you think about it, the government spends a lot of money. It spends it on goods and services, right? But it also spends it on roads and schools. So we have to include the government in here. And this is going to become very important as we start to look at monetary policy. And then we look at net exports minus imports. So what we're looking at is the value of our country's exports to other countries, things that we exit the country, less how much we bring into the country. So if we bring in more than we send out, then we are going to have a negative number here. If we export more than we bring in, then we have a positive number. Now remember, it's all of our exports in this particular case, so it does include services. The United States has a very large exportation of services. So our equation that we all need to know is GDP, or Y, is equal to C plus I plus G plus NX, okay? Exports minus imports. GDP is equal to C plus I plus G plus NX. That will be a very important equation. What's not included in the GDP? Well, intermediate goods. Back to the same thing we talked about before. Why are intermediate goods not included? Because they're included when they're sold finally. Used goods. When you buy a used car, it is not included in the GDP. That is the reason why when you listen to statistics, you will find that many times the Federal Reserve will talk about the GDP, and then it will talk about things like used car sales, home repurchases. Why are they doing that? Because they're looking at the other things that may indicate the health of the economy that are not included in the GDP. Underground production, the black market. Anything that goes on that doesn't necessarily is recorded via traditional forms will not exist in the GDP. In other words, drugs obviously don't, unless they're legal. Now, that's a really good question. The GDP, because marijuana sales are not legal in the United States overall, they are not included in the GDP. Financial transactions. So transactions that occur in the United States that are financially driven are not included in the GDP. Household production. So what am I talking about with household production? I'm talking about literally the things we do in our own home. So if you have your child in a daycare, that will be included in the GDP because there is a service being provided. However, if somebody stays home and takes care of that child, it is not included in the GDP. Transfer payments. What are transfer payments? Two that we are very well associated with and we almost all know about is Social Security and unemployment insurance. They are not included because they are a transfer of physical money from one pot, so to speak, to another pot of money. They are not purchases of goods or services. So even though that G does include quite a bit from the government, it does not include the government expenditures in terms of Social Security and unemployment insurance. It gets pulled out of our paychecks, it gets put back in to other people's paychecks. So it's not included in either of those numbers. So via the Bureau of Economic Analysis in 2003, this is the components of the GDP. And what we basically have, and this have not changed over the last maybe 20 years, but before that, it was very different. So in the 2000s, the economy is made up of the following. We have about 19-ish%, and obviously in a recession, it'll be higher, component of our GDP that is the government. Then we'll have investments. Investments in, remember, will be homes, they'll be in production, they'll be in inventory. And then we'll have consumption, personal consumption mostly. Notice how much the consumption of goods and services make up of our GDP. And then we have net exports and imports. And we were negative in 2003, that's a negative number. And this makes up the entire GDP. If we were to look across the years up until about 2008-ish, this is from the Federal Reserve, you can start to see the trends in the GDP. And this is looking yearly at GDP. And you can see that year over year, the GDP grew quite a bit in 1982, 1983. And then we had a really large dip in 1990. We were doing pretty good. And then we had a dip in the early 2000s. And then we had a very large dip in 2008. What are we looking at here? What we're looking at is that we're looking at where the economy goes up and where the economy goes down. And we'll look at cyclical nature of the economy in a little while, but you can start to see that what we're really going after is a growth rate of about 3%. So 3 to 3.5% is where we want to go. So in general, the economy has, believe it or not, on average grown that, if you would average year over year. When putting that line in there, you can see the years that we have been below it and the years that we have been very largely above it. And you can see on average, we have grown about 3%. So how has that 3% been made up? Well, in 1950, obviously the GDP was smaller, but it was also made up a little bit differently. The personal consumption, the blue line, was of course larger than the green line, but I wouldn't say it was astronomically. It was probably twice as big. By the time we get to 2016, 15, 16, you can start to see that the blue is not just twice as big as the green, it's probably 4 times as big as the green. So the personal consumption expenditures have been the portion of the GDP that has grown the largest. All right, let's play around with the GDP and see if we can figure out these components. So in each one of these cases, I am going to basically give you a case and we're going to determine how much of the GDP and which components are affected by it. Deborah spends $300 to buy her husband a dinner at the finest restaurant in Boston. Okay, so how does that work? Well, she increased her consumption, didn't she? Because she bought something. And the GDP is going to rise because of that. In this case, it's going to rise by $300 because she purchased dinner. In the second case, Sarah spends $1,200 on a new laptop to use in her publishing business. The laptop was built in China. Okay, so she made an investment. The investment was $1,200. However, she also bought it from China, which means that she added to net exports minus imports. She added to the import number. So the net export and import will fall by the same amount as her investment. So in theory, by buying that computer, but buying it from a foreign country, she had no effect on the GDP whatsoever. Jane spent $800 on a computer to use in her editing business. She bought it last year's model. And so it was on sale. Okay. So we know she spent $800, which is great, but she bought last year's model. So nothing's going to change because last year's model was counted in last year's what? Investments. Remember how I mentioned inventory? Well, inventory is counted in the GDP in the year in which it's made, not the year in which it's bought. Yeah. General Motors builds 5 million worth of cars, but consumers only buy 470 million of them. Okay, so the first key in this question was, of course, the consumers. So consumers were only buying 470. So we know the consumption is going to rise by that 470 million. Now the inventory that's left over is the difference between how much people bought and how much they built. So in this particular case, there's 330 million in inventory. So inventory investment, I, is going to rise by 30. So C rose by 470, I rose by 30. So in total, because both of those are part of the GDP is going to rise by 500. Because remember, it's C plus I plus G. So what is the difference between a real and a nominal GDP? Well, inflation is literally one of the issues that affects the GDP. The nominal GDP is the values of inputs using current prices. It is not corrected for inflation. So one of the ways I always have to remember nominal is now. Real GDP is the value of outputs using the prices of a base year. So I'll show you what that means, but it is corrected for inflation. So if we have pizzas and lattes and that's all you can get, you can literally calculate the GDP of this very simplistic economy using pizzas and lattes. So in this particular case, in order to figure out the GDP of this nice little economy, all you really have to do is say in 2011, pizzas were $10. People bought 400 of them. Pizzas were $10. People bought 400 of them. Lattes were $2. People bought 1,000 of them. Take those numbers, figure it out, and guess what you get? The GDP. Do the same thing for 2012 and 2013. You have 3 GDPs for very simplistic economies, and you can figure out how much they increased year over year. So in this particular case, between 2011 and 2012, we have calculated that the GDP in this particular simplistic economy rose 37.5%. We also discovered that between 2012 and 2013, it rose 30.9%. This is all looking at now, nominal GDP. Now, if you want to compute the real GDP, you have to use a base year. So if you use 2011 as the base year, then what ends up happening is you calculate 2011, just like before. Look at that. But then when you get to 2012, you look at the quantities, but the price that you use to calculate your GDP is the base year price. So you end up with the $10 from the base year times the quantity of the year. The $2 for the lattes times the quantity for the year, and you're going to get a slightly different GDP. You could do the same thing in 2013 using the same $10 and $2, but now the quantity is 600 and 1,200. 600 and 1,200, and you get a new GDP. Now, if you calculate the percentage increase, now using a base year and calculating the real GDP, you're going to get an increase of 20, and year over year, you're going to get an increase of 16. So what we've now discovered is there's probably an inflationary reason behind why these prices are the way they are. Now we can do nominal and GDP for pretty much everything. So in each one of these years, the nominal GDP and the real GDP have differences. But as you can see by looking at these, you can start to notice that there is a slight difference, and it's due to inflation between the two. So by looking at the nominal, now GDP for these 3 years, you can start to see this increase, fairly large, right? When you look at the real GDP, the increases aren't quite so large. But now we know the increase in physical purchasing and income, not the physical increase in purchasing and income plus inflation. So the real GDP is is corrected for inflation. Now, the change in the real GDP is the amount that GDP would change if prices were constant. So what we're saying with the real GDP is if the prices stayed the same, i.e., there is absolutely no inflation, this is what would happen to the economy as a whole. The nominal GDP is the growth in the gross domestic product with inflation included. In the United States, between 1965 and 2013, the nominal and the real GDP did have some differences. And there are quite a few different cases of why this would occur, but one of the biggest things is inflation. So between these two, you can measure how much the price difference is. Now, what does this mean here when they're exactly the same? Anybody guess that the inflation rate may have been very, very low? Yeah. And then here, maybe the inflation rate was literally negative. Now, it is one of many measures that the Federal Reserve uses. So once you were to look at this, then you would start to dig in deeper as to, is it only inflation? Is there something else? Is it inflation of one of the products? Is it inflation of only one of the groups? For instance, are consumers affected by the inflation more than investment, more than the government? Good questions. And that's where you start to dig a little deeper. The GDP deflator is a measure of the overall price levels. And what it's doing is it's calculating what's going on with pricing by taking the nominal GDP, the GDP right now, divided by the real GDP for a year. So it's one way to measure an economy's inflation rate. It's literally calculating the percent increase year over year over year. In this particular case, we can calculate the GDP deflator because we've already calculated the nominal and the real GDP, which is really fun. So we can say, okay, now we have the equation, 10. Okay, the nominal GDP for 2011, the real GDP for 2011. There's the deflator. Not a great surprise because 2011 is also the base year. Okay, now let's look at 2012. What's happened in 2012? All right. 2012, here's the nominal GDP. Go down, and we're going to find the nominal GDP here. Okay. What is the real GDP? Okay, that was the one that we calculated using 2011 prices. We put that down here. Now, look at that. Ah, we have a GDP deflator. And now we did the same thing with 2013. The GDP deflator is what? It's looking at what's going on with the GDP. So in the case between 2011 and 2012, we're seeing a GDP deflator of 14.6%. What are we seeing between 2012 and 2013? Well, we're seeing a 12.2%. So it's telling us what the relative inflation rate was. So we can calculate these for pretty much anything. And this is done fairly regularly. So you can compute the nominal GDP in 2011. You can calculate the real GDP in 2012 if we assume that the base year is 2011. And you can calculate the GDP deflators. So to calculate the nominal GDP in 2011, you're going to take the prices. So you're going to say, okay, 2011. All right, it's now nominal. I want to just do it right now. I don't need to worry about base years. So here's 30 times 900, 31 times 1,000. I'm sorry, wrong way. Oh my goodness gracious me. So 30 times 900, 100 times 192. There you go. There's the GDP. All right, so far so good. If I read the chart correctly. What's the real GDP? Oh my, what did you see in that word? I saw real. Real means I got to figure out the base year. Okay, the base year is 2011. So now I need to know what the prices are in 2011. So, okay, those are the 2011 prices. Now, what year am I looking at? 2012. So I'm going to take that 30, but I'm going to multiply it by the 2012 quantity, okay? I'm going to take the 100, I'm going to multiply it by the 2012 quantity. Now I have the real GDP in 2013. 2012, oh my. So if I need to calculate the GDP deflator in 2013, well, I got to figure out a lot of numbers, don't I? Because I didn't have anything to calculate this. So the first thing I need to do is I need to figure out what the nominal GDP is. So I know that the nominal GDP means now. So I'm going to take 36 times 1,050. I'm going to take 100 times 205. Now I got the nominal GDP. The real GDP, okay, what's the base year? Okay, the base year is 2011. So I'm going to need these prices, right? I'm going to take 30, that's base price, but I'm going to multiply by this quantity, 2013's. I'm going to take 2011's base price, and I'm going to multiply it by the quantity in 2013, and I'm going to get this number. Now, how do you calculate the GDP deflator? Okay, here's the equation right up here. All right, so we need the nominal. So for the year, the nominal was this number here. Put that there. And I need the real. All right. Now I've got the GDP deflator. So I know that what? I have now calculated the inflation rate in 2013 as 12.1% using the GDP deflator. What it doesn't tell us, well, it doesn't tell us our standard of living in some ways. So we know that it tells us, okay, how many goods and services have we been purchasing? How many services have we been using? But we don't know how we are. It's not a measure of well-being. It doesn't measure income distribution. So for instance, the GDP per capita, and what is a GDP per capita? It means that it's taking the GDP and it's dividing by the population. GDP per capita does not measure whether or not everybody's getting the same amount, or whether or not there's some people that are getting a ton of money and a ton of the GDP, right? And other people who are getting a few cents. It doesn't measure non-monetary things, such as barters and household activities. So those are things to keep in mind. The well-being of the nation is not necessarily included in the GDP. It doesn't take into account another one of the pieces of the well-being, externalities. We learned about externalities at the very beginning of this class. I think it was chapter 1 or 2. And we talked about them. And there are things that occur that are occur because of economic activity, such as decrease in leisure activity. Why? Because people work harder. They are selling their labor, and by selling their labor, they have less leisure. Or an externality is environmental concerns. None of this is measured in the GDP. You can have a fabulous real GDP per capita and be polluting the environment. And people can be working 100 hours a week. And it does not measure how anyone's well-being is socially. You could have discrimination. You can have all sorts of issues. None of this is measured by the GDP. So it correlates with the standard of living, but is not necessarily measured with a measurement of the standard of living, if that makes sense. So Robert Kennedy's kind of said this best. The gross domestic product does not allow for the health of our children, the quality of their education, the joy of their play. It does not include the beauty of our poetry, the strength of our marriages, the intelligence of our public debate, or the integrity of our public officials. It measures neither our courage, nor our wisdom, nor our devotion to our country. It measures everything in short except that which makes life worthwhile. And it can tell us everything about America except why we are proud Americans. We are proud that we are Americans. Sorry about that. And that is actually really important because it's a good economic variable, but we have to remember that economists need to temper that by a lot of these other variables. That's the reason why when economists look at the GDP, they look at the GDP, but they also look at all the other measurements that go into an economy's well-being, education levels, divorce rates, abuse rates, poverty levels. Those are all very important as well. So why do we care about it? Because it does give us an idea of whether or not an economy is able to afford better schools, cleaner environments, and healthcare. And it does have many indicators that are positively correlated to it. So, life expectancy is one of them. The real GDP per person and life expectancy does have a good correlation. For instance, if you look at the countries with a higher GDP per person, like Japan, Germany, and the US, guess what? They also have pretty good life expectancies, at least over 70. However, guess what? China, Mexico, and Brazil, who have very low GDPs, also have some pretty good life expectancies. However, there is a lot of trending here about countries with lower life expectancies and indeed also lower GDP per person. We can also look at average schooling. And you can see that when we start looking at schooling, that there is some correlation here. The higher GDPs tend to have the higher schoolings. So this would be an argument if you were trying to say whether or not GDP is correlated with schooling. Yes, it does appear that if you keep people in school an average of 12 years, basically high school, you're going to end up with an economy that has a higher GDP. Water quality. All right. Why do we care about water quality? Because water quality also affects health. So clearly, we would like to have our water quality pretty high, over 90, I would think. So if we were to look at GDP and look at countries, the only countries that appear to have good water quality also have the higher relative GDPs. So one could say that by raising GDP, one could help your water quality and thus hopefully the safety of your population. So how do we grow it? Well, growth of population is an issue because remember, GDP per capita, you do need enough workers, but you don't want too many workers. Increasing our participation, growth in productivity, how much output per worker. So how many units each worker can produce helps what? GDP. More units, more things to sell. More things to sell, higher GDP. So an increase in capita per worker helps, capita being in this case elements that increase productivity. For instance, in this example, the robots. They will increase the overall productivity factor. Now remember, another one that works really well for productivity is education. So the gross domestic product does measure a country's total income and expenditure. It has 4 components, C plus I plus G plus NX, or consumption, investment, government, plus net exports minus imports. Nominal GDP measures the current prices, the prices right now. Real GDP is a measurement of the prices at the constant base year and is corrected for inflation. GDP is a good indicator of economic well-being, but isn't perfect, as we just discovered. There's quite a few elements it doesn't look at. Thank you very much. Take a look at additional resources available, as well as move on to chapter 11. Thanks, guys. Have a good day.